In the perpetual twilight of a Norwegian winter, far above the Arctic Circle, the city of Tromsø lay shrouded in snow and silence. It was February 1937, and the polar night had only just relinquished its grip, allowing faint daylight to creep over the fjords. Beneath a sky ablaze, with the ethereal dance of the Aurora Borealis, ribbons of green and violet swirling like spectral veils, a small party of travellers stood on the frozen shore, gazing upward in awe. Suddenly, a scream pierced the frigid air. Magnus Haraldsson, the wealthy Arctic explorer, staggered forward, clutching his chest before collapsing face down in the snow. By the time his companions reached him, he was dead, poisoned, it seemed, under the watchful eye of the Northern Lights themselves. And among those companions stood a diminutive Belgian with impeccable moustaches, Hercule Poirot. Chapter 1. Arrival in the land of the midnight sun. The coastal steamer, Hurtigruten, cut through the black waters of the Tromsøysundet like a blade through silk, its lights reflecting in fractured gold upon the fjord. It was February 1937, and though the polar night had loosened its iron grip, daylight remained a timid visitor, pale, brief, and reluctant. Snow lay deep upon the quays and rooftops of Tromsø, muffling every sound save the low throb of engines and the occasional cry of a gull wheeling overhead. Hercule Poirot stood at the rail, bundled in an overcoat that was far too elegant for such a wilderness. His patent leather shoes, gleaming despite the salt spray, were already regretting this journey. The cold bit at his ears and threatened the perfect symmetry of his moustaches, which he guarded with the tenderness of a mother for her child. He disliked the cold intensely. It offended his sense of order. Yet a telegram, terse and urgent, had summoned him from the comforts of London to this frozen extremity of Europe. The message had come from Magnus Haraldsson, a name known even in cosmopolitan circles. Explorer, trapper, lecturer, and lately a man of considerable wealth derived from Arctic enterprises. Haraldsson wrote of a delicate matter requiring the discretion of the greatest detective in the world. Flattery, Poirot reflected with a small smile, was ever the key to his curiosity. As the gangway was lowered, Poirot descended with careful dignity, his cane tapping upon the frozen planks. Waiting upon the quay stood a burly figure in a fur-lined parka, beard white with hoarfrost, eyes bright as a husky's. This was Haraldsson himself, unmistakable from the photographs Poirot had seen in illustrated newspapers. Broad-shouldered, weathered, exuding the vitality of a man who had stared down polar bears and blizzards alike. "Monsieur Poirot!" Haraldsson's voice boomed across the snow. "Velkommen! Welcome to the top of the world!" Poirot inclined his head. "Monsieur Haraldsson, it is an honor, though I confess the climate is less welcoming than your person." Haraldsson laughed, a sound like cracking ice. "You will grow accustomed. Tonight we shall see the greatest spectacle on earth, the Aurora Borealis in full glory. I have arranged everything at my lodge beyond the town. Come, the sleigh awaits." A reindeer-drawn sleigh stood ready, its driver a silent Sami in colourful traditional dress. Poirot allowed himself to be handed aboard, settling among the furs with the wariness of a cat upon water. As they glided through Tromsø's wooden streets, past the Arctic Cathedral's stark triangle still under construction, past warehouses smelling of cod and tar, the explorer spoke enthusiastically of his plans. "I am launching a new venture," Haraldsson explained. "Tourists, wealthy ones, wish to experience the true Arctic. Not mere cruises, but genuine expeditions, dog sleds, ice camping, the Northern Lights. You, Monsieur Poirot, shall be my guest of honor for the inaugural viewing, and perhaps He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "You will advise me on a small matter of security." Poirot's green eyes gleamed. "One does not travel to the Arctic Circle for the climate, mon ami. I am at your service." They left the town behind, climbing a track that wound between snow-laden pines toward a promontory overlooking the fjord. There, silhouetted against the pale sky, stood Haraldsson's lodge, a substantial timber structure built in the dragon style popular among Norwegian nationalists, its roof carved with serpents and vines now capped with snow. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, promising warmth. Inside, the air was rich with the scent of pine logs burning in a massive stone hearth. Reindeer skins covered the floors. Trophies of the chase, polar bear, wolf, walrus, stared glassily from the walls. A long table was already set for dinner, silver glinting in the lamplight. Haraldsson's guests awaited them. First his niece, Ingrid Larsson, tall, blonde, with the cool beauty of a glacier. Her eyes were pale blue, watchful, and her smile did not quite reach them. She greeted Poirot with perfect courtesy in lightly accented French. Then Dr. Erik Björnsson, a serious young man in his 30s, spectacles glinting as he rose. He had accompanied Haraldsson on his most recent expedition to Spitsbergen and spoke with the earnestness of a scientist. His handshake was firm, almost anxious. Captain Lars Olsson, grizzled and sea-weathered, nodded gruffly. His hands were calloused, his eyes narrowed as if perpetually scanning a stormy horizon. He had sailed with Haraldsson for 20 years, he said, and knew every reef from here to Novaya Zemlya. Last, and most unexpectedly, Frida Haraldsson, Magnus's daughter, whom Poirot had believed to be living in Oslo. She was darker than the others, with stormy grey eyes and a mouth set in defiance. She had arrived only that morning, unannounced, and the air between father and daughter crackled with unspoken history. Dinner was served: cloudberries in cream, smoked salmon, reindeer steak in juniper sauce, and potent aquavit that burned like liquid fire. Conversation flowed, cautiously at first, then with increasing tension. Ingrid spoke of her uncle's generosity, how he had supported her studies in Paris. Yet her tone carried an undercurrent of calculation, as though every kindness were entered in a ledger. Dr. Björnsson enthused about auroral research, hinting at discoveries made on their last voyage. Discoveries, he implied, that Haraldsson intended to claim entirely for himself. Captain Olsson drank deeply and muttered about wages long overdue, about promises broken when the fur market collapsed. Frida confronted her father directly. "You abandoned mother for your ice and glory. Now you play the patriarch with your tourist schemes. Why should I not demand what is mine before it is too late?" Haraldsson's face flushed beneath his beard. "This is neither the time nor place, Frida." Poirot observed silently, his small frame upright in the carved chair, his eyes missing nothing. The little grey cells, he reflected, were already at work. Greed, resentment, old wounds, here was fertile ground for mischief. After dinner, as midnight approached, Haraldsson rose with sudden enthusiasm. "Come, the sky clears. The lights will dance for us tonight." They donned coats and boots and stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the frozen fjord. The air was so cold it seared the lungs. Above them, the stars burned with unnatural brilliance. And then, slowly, majestically, the Aurora Borealis unfurled. Ribbons of emerald and violet shimmered into existence, twisting and flowing like living silk. Great curtains of light rippled across the heavens, silent and immense. The party stood transfixed, breath pluming white in the frigid air. Haraldsson had brought a thermos of hot coffee laced with brandy to ward off the chill. He poured himself a cup, sipping as he adjusted a tripod-mounted camera to capture the display. For a moment he stood slightly apart from the others, silhouetted against the glowing sky. Poirot, ever observant, noticed the explorer's hand tremble as he raised the cup again. Then abruptly, Haraldson staggered. The thermos fell from his grasp, spilling dark liquid upon the snow. He clutched at his chest, gasped once, a terrible rasping sound, and pitched forward, face down into the pristine white. Ingrid screamed. The others rushed forward, but Poirot was already kneeling, his gloved fingers seeking a pulse that was not there. Magnus Haraldsson, master of the Arctic, was dead, poisoned beneath the most beautiful sky on earth, with only the silent northern lights as witness, and Hercule Poirot, far from the ordered world he loved, knew that his Arctic holiday had become a case of murder. Chapter 2. The Frozen Corpse. The wind had risen during the night, driving fine snow against the lodge windows like 1,000 insistent fingers. By dawn, the Aurora Borealis had vanished, leaving only a cold, iron-grey sky and the vast silence of the Arctic winter. Inside the great room, the fire had burned low, but no one had slept. Magnus Haraldsson's body lay where it had fallen, covered now by a reindeer skin at Poirot's firm instruction. "We disturb nothing until the police arrive," he had declared, his voice cutting through the first hysteria like a scalpel. The others had obeyed, though reluctantly, retreating indoors to huddle around the hearth with brandy and accusations unspoken. Poirot himself had passed the hours in a high-backed chair, eyes half closed, hands steepled beneath his chin. He appeared to doze, but his mind was acutely awake, arranging and rearranging the facts as precisely as he arranged his moustaches each morning. The little grey cells, he reflected, required no sleep, only order. At 10 o'clock the jingle of bells announced the arrival of Inspector Knut Hagen. He came by dog sled, accompanied by 2 constables and a doctor from Tromsø, their faces raw from the wind. Hagen was a tall, spare man with a trim beard and eyes the colour of glacier ice. He moved with the unhurried authority of one accustomed to commanding both men and weather. "God morgen, gentlemen, Fröken," he greeted them formally, removing his fur cap. His English was careful and precise. "I regret the circumstances of our meeting." Poirot rose with a small bow. "Inspector Hagen, I am Hercule Poirot. It is I who sent the wireless message. The death of Monsieur Haraldsson is no accident." Hagen's brows lifted fractionally. "So I understood. Poison, you believe?" "Without doubt. Cyanide, I suspect, swift and merciless. You will confirm, naturally, but the symptoms were unmistakable. The sudden collapse, the convulsion, the odour of bitter almonds faint upon the breath." The inspector nodded to the doctor, who knelt beside the body with a medical bag. While the examination proceeded, Hagen turned to the assembled guests. Ingrid Larsson sat pale and composed upon a sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Björnsson stood by the window, staring out at the fjord as though answers might be found in its frozen surface. Captain Olsen paced before the fire like a caged bear, while Frida Haraldsson sat apart, eyes red from weeping or rage. It was difficult to tell which. "Tell me exactly what occurred," Hagen said quietly. Poirot supplied the narrative with his customary clarity. The dinner, the decision to view the aurora, the thermos of coffee prepared indoors by Haraldsson himself, or so it was believed, the moment of separation to adjust the camera tripod, the sudden stagger and fall. "No one approached him closely in that final minute?" Hagen asked. "All stood together upon the terrace," Poirot replied. Yet in such a spectacle as the Northern Lights, the attention is drawn upward. A movement at the edge of vision might pass unnoticed. And Monsieur Haraldson was a few paces apart, silhouetted against the glow. The doctor rose. Cyanide poisoning, he confirmed. Potassium cyanide, almost certainly. Death within minutes. The coffee in the thermos contains a lethal concentration. Hagen's gaze swept the room. The thermos was Monsieur Haraldson's own, prepared by his own hand. It was his habit, Ingrid said, her voice steady but low. Uncle disliked the cold intensely. He always carried hot coffee laced with a little brandy when we went outdoors at night. And last evening, I prepared it, Frida said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. She lifted her chin defiantly. I offered to make fresh coffee for everyone. Uncle asked for his usual. I filled his thermos from the pot on the stove. A silence followed, heavy as the snow outside. Captain Olsen snorted. So the grieving daughter prepares Papa's last drink. Convenient. Frida's eyes flashed. I wish to reconcile. I added nothing. Enough, Hagen said mildly. We will establish facts, not trade insults. He turned to Poirot. You examined the scene, monsieur. Immediately. The thermos lay open beside the body, half empty. No spill upon the snow except from the final cup. The poison was in the liquid he carried outdoors. No one else drank from that vessel. Björnson cleared his throat. There is a medicine cabinet in the lodge. Cyanide is sometimes kept for certain purposes. Trapping, perhaps. Haraldson's expeditions had indeed used poisons for specimens, Poirot recalled. The cabinet was unlocked. Anyone might have taken a vial. Hagen dispatched a constable to search. Within minutes the man returned with a small brown bottle bearing a skull and crossbones label. Potassium cyanide crystals, he reported. Half the contents missing. No fingerprints visible. Wiped clean, perhaps. Poirot examined the bottle with a pocket lens, or handled with gloves. Observed the faint smear of grease upon the glass, perhaps from fur-lined mittens. Olsen grunted. We all wear such gloves here. Precisely, Poirot murmured. The inspector ordered the body removed to Tromsø for formal autopsy. Then requested private interviews. While preparations were made, Poirot took the opportunity to study the terrace anew in daylight. The snow had drifted, but the outline of Haraldson's fall remained. The dark stain of spilled coffee. The scattered crystals where the thermos had tipped. He noted the position of the camera tripod, exactly 6 paces from the group's usual vantage point. A deliberate separation. Something else caught his eye. A pocket watch, half buried in snow near the body. Haraldson's gold hunter, chain broken. The hands stood at 11:47 precisely. Poirot picked it up carefully. The glass was cracked, as though struck violently in the fall, yet the mechanism ticked on softly. He opened the case. Inside, engraved upon the back, was a dedication, to Magnus from Astrid with eternal love, 1918. Astrid, Haraldson's late wife, Frida's mother. Poirot slipped the watch into his pocket. The timing intrigued him. The aurora had reached its peak brilliance shortly after midnight, according to Björnson's excited commentary. Why had the watch stopped more than an hour earlier? He returned indoors to find Hagen concluding his initial notes. "Your thoughts, Monsieur Poirot?" the inspector asked. "That we have a murder most carefully planned," Poirot replied. "The poison administered in the one vessel only the victim would drink. The spectacular aurora, chosen as backdrop to distract every eye. The isolated lodge to delay investigation. And yet—" He paused, twirling his moustache thoughtfully. "And yet, the murderer has made one small error. The little grey cells will discover it." Outside, the dog-sled bells jingled as Haraldson's body was borne away across the snow. Inside, suspicion settled like frost upon the hearts of those who remained. The northern lights had vanished with the dawn, but the shadow of death lingered beneath the dragon-carved roof. And Hercule Poirot knew that the true storm was only beginning. Chapter 3. Secrets of the Ice. The storm arrived that afternoon with the sudden fury of an Arctic tempest. Wind howled down from the mountains, driving sheets of snow against the lodge until the world beyond the windows vanished entirely. The telephone line to Tromsø snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The generator sputtered, but held. They were isolated now, cut off from the world as completely as if they had been adrift on an ice floe. Hercule Poirot regarded the situation with philosophical calm. "It is perfect," he murmured to himself, standing before the great window with hands clasped behind his back. The murderer and the witnesses confined together, like rats in a trap. The truth cannot escape. Inspector Hagen had remained at the lodge rather than risk the journey back in the blizzard. He and Poirot agreed upon a division of labour. Hagen would conduct formal interviews and searches, while Poirot, with his unobtrusive manner, would observe and question in his own fashion. The little Belgian wasted no time. He began with Ingrid Larsen, inviting her to the small study that smelled of pipe tobacco and old maps. She entered gracefully, removing her fur-trimmed gloves with deliberate care. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, offering her a chair near the fire, "you were close to your uncle, I believe?" Ingrid's pale eyes met his steadily. "He was generous to me. After my parents died, he became guardian and benefactor. I owed him everything. And yet," Poirot said gently, "one senses a certain reserve in your affection." She hesitated, then gave a small, wintry smile. Uncle Magnus was not an easy man. He had plans to remarry, a young woman from Bergen, scarcely older than myself. If he had done so, his will would have changed. I would have been left with little. Poirot's eyebrows rose delicately. "You knew of this intended marriage?" "I overheard him speaking to Captain Olsen about it. He wished to secure the family line with a son. A practical man, my uncle." Practical indeed, Poirot reflected. A motive as old as inheritance itself. Next came Dr. Erik Bjørnsen, summoned from the library where he had been poring over scientific journals as though nothing had occurred. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot greeted him, "you accompanied Monsieur Haraldsson on his last expedition to Spitzbergen, is it not so?" Bjørnsen adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Yes, we made important observations of auroral phenomena linked to magnetic disturbances. I believe we discovered mineral deposits that intensify the display. And yet," Poirot said softly, "I understand there was disagreement over credit for this discovery." The young doctor flushed. Haraldsson intended to claim it entirely. He mocked my theories in private, called them fanciful. He had the fame, the funds, I had only the science. Without recognition, my career is finished. Jealousy of the intellect, a powerful force, Poirot knew. He dismissed Bjørnsen with a courteous nod and summoned Captain Lars Olsen. The old seafarer entered smelling of aquavit and the sea, though no ocean was near. He dropped into a chair without ceremony. "You have sailed with Haraldsson for many years, Captain?" 23, Olsen growled. "From Greenland to Franz Josef Land. Shed storms that would freeze a man's soul. And yet you were not content?" Olsen's eyes narrowed. "He owed me wages for 3 seasons. When the fur trade collapsed, he cried poverty while building this fancy lodge. And there was another matter." He hesitated. "Speak freely," Poirot encouraged. "Years ago, a smuggling run, furs, ivory, Minor enough, but Haraldsson held the proof over me like a sword, threatened exposure if I pressed for my money. Blackmail. Another thread in the web. Last, Frida Haraldsson. She entered the study with the air of one walking to her execution. Dark hair dishevelled, eyes stormy. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said kindly, "you arrived unexpectedly yesterday. Why? To demand what was mine," she replied bitterly. "My father abandoned my mother for his precious explorations. She died alone while he chased glory. I wanted my inheritance before he squandered it on his tourist schemes." And was there more? She looked away. On her deathbed, Mother confessed to something. Magnus was not my true father. He adopted me only for appearances after marrying her. I am illegitimate, he knew, and never told me. The revelation struck Poirot like a cold wind. Identity shattered, a wound deeper than money. He thanked her and returned to the great room, where Hagen was concluding a search of the premises. The inspector held up several items. A bundle of anonymous letters found in Haraldsson's desk, warning of betrayal and death. A draft codicil to the will naming Ingrid primary beneficiary in the event of unnatural death. A Sami knife with a bone handle, discovered half buried in snow near the terrace. Its blade clean but suggestive. An outsider, Hagen mused. Poirot shook his head firmly. "No, Inspector. Observe the footprints reported earlier, leading away from the lodge but erased by wind. Too convenient. And the knife, placed deliberately. The Aurora viewing was planned days in advance. All were outside together. The killer is among us." That evening, as the storm raged unabated, Poirot requested the group to reassemble on the terrace, lanterns in hand, to recreate the fatal moment. The wind had dropped somewhat. The sky was clear, stars glittering like frost. "Stand as you stood last night," Poirot instructed. They obeyed reluctantly. He positioned himself where Haraldsson had fallen. "Observe," he said. Monsieur Haraldsson stepped aside to adjust his camera tripod. Here. For perhaps 30 seconds he was separated. In the brilliance of the aurora, who would notice a figure approaching with a second thermos, offering a warmer drink? Ingrid paled. No one carried a second thermos. Precisely. Yet traces of lipstick were found upon the rim of the fatal one. Vivid red. Both you, Mademoiselle Ingrid, and you, Mademoiselle Frida, favour such a shade. Frida gasped. "I lost my lipstick yesterday. It was in my coat pocket." A sudden gust extinguished the lanterns. Darkness swallowed them. When light was restored, Poirot held a telegram newly delivered by a brave ski messenger from town. He read it silently, then folded it with care. "Monsieur Haraldsson consulted me weeks ago," he announced quietly. "He feared for his life. He wrote of threats received, of betrayal close to home. He begged my presence not merely as a guest, but as protector." The room fell silent save for the wind's moan. Someone in this isolated lodge had known Poirot was coming. Known and acted before he could prevent the crime. And now, with the storm sealing them in, the murderer walked free among them, and Hercule Poirot knew the game had entered its most dangerous phase. Chapter 4. Whispers under the lights. The second night brought no respite from the storm. Wind rattled the lodge windows like a living thing seeking entry, and snow piled in drifts against the doors. The generator coughed and steadied, casting flickering shadows across the beamed ceiling. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of timber sounded like a footstep, every gust a whispered accusation. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the great room long after the others had retired, a single lamp burning beside him. Before him on the table lay the items gathered thus far, The brown cyanide bottle, the broken pocket watch, the anonymous letters, the Sami knife now wrapped in cloth. He arranged them with geometric precision, then leaned back, eyes half closed, allowing the little grey cells to dance. At length he rose and moved silently through the lodge, his footsteps muffled by thick carpets of reindeer hide. He paused outside each bedroom door, listening. From Captain Olsen's room came the low rumble of snoring. From Ingrid's, nothing. From Björnson's, the faint scratch of pen upon paper. Even at this hour, the doctor wrote. Frida's door stood slightly ajar. Poirot glimpsed her within, sitting at a small dressing table, staring at her reflection as though it belonged to a stranger. He returned to the main room and poured himself a small glass of Haraldson's excellent Calvados. The brandy warmed him, and he permitted himself a sigh of satisfaction. Isolation, though inconvenient, had its advantages. No one could flee, no one could conspire with outsiders. The murderer must remain, watching, waiting. Dawn, if the grey pallor filtering through the windows could be called dawn, brought Inspector Hagen to Poirot's side. The Norwegian's face was drawn with fatigue. "I have searched every room thoroughly," he reported in a low voice. "Nothing conclusive. But the codicil to the will, the one naming Ingrid primary beneficiary upon unnatural death, is written in a hand very like Haraldson's own. Yet the ink appears fresher than the original document. A forgery, perhaps," Poirot murmured, "or a genuine draft hidden for safety. We shall see." They gathered the suspects in the dining room for breakfast, though no one had appetite. The table was set with cold smoked salmon, rye bread, and strong coffee, but plates remained untouched. Poirot stood at the head, small and immaculate, despite the trying circumstances. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began pleasantly, "let us speak of alibis. At the precise moment Monsieur Haraldsson collapsed, each of you claims to have been gazing at the aurora. Yet human nature is fallible. The eyes are drawn upward, yes, but peripheral movement may still be noted." Captain Olsen shifted heavily in his chair. "I stepped indoors for a moment," he admitted gruffly. "My gloves were in my coat pocket by the door. The cold was fierce." Björnsson cleared his throat. "I moved a little distance away to photograph the lights from a clearer angle. The terrace railing obstructed my view." Ingrid spoke softly. "I was helping Frida adjust her scarf. The wind had loosened it." Frida nodded confirmation, though her eyes avoided her father's former companions. Poirot's gaze rested upon each in turn. So, brief separations, momentary lapses of attention, opportunities, one might say. He placed the pocket watch upon the table with a soft click. And this, found beside the body. The hand stopped at 11:47. Yet we all agree the aurora reached its height nearer midnight, and the collapse occurred then. Why does the watch lie? "Broken in the fall," Olsen suggested. "No, the mechanism functions perfectly. The crown is pulled out, deliberately stopped." A murmur rippled around the table. "Moreover," Poirot continued, "the main will leaves the bulk of the estate to a charity for Arctic research, unless Monsieur Haraldsson remarried and produced an heir. In that case, the new wife would inherit, but this codicil changes everything upon unnatural death. Curious, is it not?" Ingrid's composure cracked. "You imply I forged it?" "I imply nothing, mademoiselle. I observe." Frida rose suddenly, chair scraping. "This is intolerable. You pick at us like crows while my father lies dead. Dr. Björnsson, tell them how Uncle planned to expose your plagiarism in his memoir." Björnsson paled. "That is untrue, is it?" Frida pressed. "I found notes in his desk. He intended to reveal how you falsified data from Spitsbergen for your precious theories. Chaos threatened to erupt, voices rising in accusation and denial. Hagen's calm authority restored order, but the damage was done. Trust, already fragile, shattered like thin ice. That evening the storm eased somewhat, allowing faint starlight to pierce the clouds. The aurora returned, weaker than before, pale green curtains shimmering on the horizon. Poirot stood alone on the terrace, breathing the knife-sharp air, when he heard footsteps behind him. It was Ingrid, wrapped in a silver fox coat. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "may I speak privately?" He inclined his head. They moved to the far end of the terrace, away from the windows. "I did not forge the codicil," she began, voice trembling, "but I knew of it. Uncle showed it to me weeks ago. He said it was insurance against those who wished him harm. He feared someone close. And the intended remarriage? A fiction. He invented it to test reactions, to see who would panic at the thought of disinheritance." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Astute. And who panicked, mademoiselle?" She hesitated, all of them in their way. "But Dr. Björnson most of all. He has feelings for me." Uncle forbade any attachment. Said Björnson was ambitious, not suitable. Love, always love, complicates the equation. They returned indoors to find consternation. Someone had tampered with Poirot's bedtime tisane, left cooling upon a side table. A white sediment lay at the bottom, harmless sleeping powder, but in sufficient quantity to fell a horse. Hagen examined it grimly. "An attempt to silence you, monsieur." Poirot merely smiled, or to warn, the murderer grows nervous. He retired to his room, but did not drink the tisane. Instead he sat in darkness listening. Hours later, a soft creak upon the stairs. A shadow passed his door, paused, then moved on. Poirot waited a full minute before slipping silently into the corridor. The shadow descended to the great room. Moonlight through the windows revealed a figure in a dark dressing gown, kneeling before the hearth. Papers were being fed, hurriedly into the flames, letters, documents. Poirot stepped forward. A cold night for burning evidence, n'est-ce pas? The figure whirled, face caught in the firelight. Dr. Erik Björnson. I could not sleep, he stammered. Old expedition journals, nothing important. But Poirot had glimpsed the handwriting upon a burning sheet, Haraldson's. The doctor had sought to destroy proof. Of what? Scientific fraud, or something far more deadly. Upstairs, a door opened softly. Someone else had heard the commotion and now watched from the shadows. The aurora outside pulsed faintly, as though the northern lights themselves held their breath, waiting for the next move in this deadly game beneath their indifferent gaze. Chapter 5. The Magnetic Deception. The third day dawned clearer, though the cold remained merciless. A pale sun hung low over the fjord, turning the snow to a blinding sheet of diamonds. The storm had passed, leaving the world muffled and still, but the air inside the lodge crackled with unspoken dread. Inspector Hagen received word by radio that a snowplow was clearing the road from Tromsø. Help and removal of the body would arrive by evening. Until then, the little group remained prisoners of their own suspicions. Hercule Poirot spent the morning in Haraldson's private study, surrounded by maps pinned to the walls. Charts of Spitsbergen, Greenland, the pack ice routes marked in red ink. Upon the desk lay ledgers, correspondence, and a locked mahogany box that Hagen had forced open the previous night. Inside were specimens, small vials of minerals, glittering under the lamp like frozen stars. Poirot lifted one vial carefully. The label, in Björnson's neat hand, read, "Magnetic iron ore, enhanced auroral conductivity." A second vial contained a fine white powder, potassium cyanide, identical to that from the medicine cabinet. He summoned Dr. Björnsson. "You recognize these, docteur?" Björnsson's face drained of colour. "Specimens from our last expedition. The mineral is rare, potentially valuable for new scientific instruments. Haraldsson insisted on keeping them here. The cyanide, we used it to preserve certain biological samples." "And yet half is missing from this vial also," Poirot observed mildly. "Convenient for murder." "I did not," Björnsson began hotly, then stopped. "Someone is trying to implicate me." "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps the truth is simpler." He dismissed the doctor and turned to the ledgers. Income from furs had indeed dwindled. Haraldsson's wealth now rested on the proposed tourist ventures and on the potential sale of mining rights to the magnetic mineral. A letter from a German scientific firm offered a substantial sum, provided Haraldsson could prove sole discovery. Credit, once again, at the heart of it. Captain Olsen was next. Poirot found him in the boathouse, checking the lodge's small motor launch frozen into the ice. "You searched my quarters again, little man," Olsen growled without turning. "Inspector Hagen searched, Captain, and found interesting items. Ivory walrus tusks without proper permits. Sami artifacts that belong in museums. Smuggling, yes?" Olsen spat into the snow. "Old sins. Haraldsson knew. He threatened to report me unless I captained his tourist ships for nothing." "But you say the blackmail was reversed?" Olsen's eyes glinted. "I found proof last year. He faked the rescue that made him famous. 1928, the Italia airship disaster. He claimed to have saved survivors, but logs show he arrived after the Russians. Hero built on lies." A reputation threatened, motive enough for a proud man. Ingrid Larsen received Poirot in the sitting room, embroidery in her lap though the needle had not moved. "You wish to speak of love, mademoiselle?" She flushed. "Dr. Björnsson has been attentive. I did not encourage him, but Uncle noticed. He said Eric was a fortune hunter, that he coveted the mineral rights more than me. He forbade any engagement." "And your own heart?" "I respected Uncle's wishes, but Eric grew desperate. He spoke of elopement, of taking the mineral samples and selling them independently. Desperation breeds violence." Frida was last. Poirot found her on the terrace, staring at the place where her father had fallen. "The locket you wear," Poirot said gently. "May I see?" Reluctantly she opened it. Inside was a photograph of a young man, dark, intense, unmistakably not Haraldsson. "My real father," she whispered, "a rival explorer. Mother loved him, but he died in a crevasse before I was born. Magnus married her, knowing the child was not his. He adopted me for appearances, for the respectable family image he needed for his lectures. And you discovered this recently?" "From Mother's letters hidden away. I came here to confront him, to demand the share I deserved as his legal daughter despite blood." All had lied, all had motive. Poirot gathered them that afternoon in the great room. The stopped watch lay before him. "This watch did not break in the fall," he declared. "It was stopped deliberately to suggest the time of death was earlier, perhaps indoors. Yet the body was warm, the coffee still hot. The poison acted swiftly, but not instantly. Cyanide can take minutes." He held up the thermos, now cleaned but preserved. Traces of lipstick upon the rim, deliberately applied, to implicate a woman. Ingrid touched her lips involuntarily, but the shade matches Frida's exactly. And yet, the killer wore gloves. Traces of rare Arctic fox fur upon the cyanide vial. Fur from Haraldsson's own coat, kept in the hall. Anyone might borrow it. Olsen shifted uncomfortably. Or, Poirot continued, the fur was transferred deliberately, a false clue. Dusk fell early. As the group dispersed for an uneasy dinner, Poirot lingered by the generator shed. The huge machine had been running erratically all day. He examined the fuel line, cut cleanly with a knife. Minutes later the lights flickered and died, plunging the lodge into darkness lit only by the fire's glow. Panic rippled through the rooms. Footsteps hurried, a door slammed. Then a sharp crack echoed through the blackness. A gunshot. Poirot, candle in hand, raced toward the sound. In the corridor outside his room, he found a bullet embedded in the wooden wall, exactly where his head would have been had he been standing there moments earlier. Hagen appeared, revolver drawn. Someone fired from the stairwell. Footprints in the fresh snow outside, leading away, then vanishing toward the trees. The murderer had struck again boldly, in the dark, and missed. Poirot touched the bullet hole thoughtfully. They grow careless, Inspector. Fear makes them rash. But the little grey cells are not so easily silenced. Outside, the aurora began to stir once more, faint ribbons of green unfurling across the stars, as though the northern sky itself watched the drama below with cold, eternal patience. The net was tightening, and the killer knew it. One more night in the lodge, and the road would open. Time was running out, for murderer and detective alike. Chapter 6. Shadows on the Snow. The road from Tromsø opened at last. Late in the afternoon, the low growl of a snowcat engine reached the lodge, and soon 2 vehicles crunched up the track. The police transport to remove Haraldson's body, and a supply lorry bringing fresh provisions and mail. With them came 3 additional constables, their presence a quiet reminder that this was no longer merely a house of mourning, but a prison under guard. Inspector Hogan greeted his men with relief, issuing brisk orders. The body, preserved in the cold outbuilding, was loaded with solemn care. Yet even as routine returned, the atmosphere inside the lodge remained charged, as though the aurora's eerie light had seeped into the very walls. Hercule Poirot watched the proceedings from the terrace, gloved hands resting upon his cane. The sun had already dipped behind the mountains, leaving a twilight glow that turned the snow to lavender. He felt the case turning, like a ship coming about in a narrow fjord. The attempts upon his own life, the sedative, the gunshot in the dark, had been clumsy, born of panic. The murderer was losing composure. That evening, after a subdued supper, Poirot requested the group to assemble once more in the great room. The fire roared high, casting long shadows that danced like the northern lights themselves. "Mes amis," he began, his voice precise and calm, "we approach the heart of the matter. Let us lay all secrets bare." He placed upon the table the bundle of anonymous letters found in Haraldson's desk. "These arrived over several months," he said, "typed upon an old Remington machine. There, in the study. Warnings of betrayal, promises of retribution. Someone in this house composed them to create an illusion of external threat." Frida stirred. "I received no such letters." "No, mademoiselle. But you found others among your mother's effects. Letters from your true father. You came here intending reconciliation, yet brought with you proof that Haraldson's public image as devoted family man was false." She nodded slowly. "I wanted him to acknowledge me publicly, to give me my rightful place before he rewrote his will." Björnson spoke next, voice unsteady. "I too have a confession. The mineral data from Spitsbergen, I embellished certain readings to strengthen my theory. Haraldsson discovered it. He threatened to expose me unless I signed over all rights to him." Captain Olsen laughed bitterly. "And I held the greater card, the faked rescue of 28, I kept the original ship's log hidden these years. When he refused my wages, I threatened to send it to the newspapers. He laughed, said no one would believe a smuggler over a national hero. Ingrid remained silent, pale hands clasped in her lap. Poirot continued, "So each of you had cause to silence him, yet only one acted. Observe the sequence." He held up the Sami knife, planted near the body to suggest an outsider, perhaps a wronged indigenous hunter. But the blade is new, purchased in Tromsø last month, by Captain Olsen for carving reindeer meat. Olsen shrugged. "I mislaid it days ago." "Convenient," Poirot murmured, "and the footprints leading away, made by skis taken from the shed, then abandoned in deep snow, where wind erased the return trail." He turned to the lipstick trace. Mademoiselle Frida's shade, yes, but the tube itself was stolen from her room and deliberately applied to the thermos rim after the poison was added, a crude attempt to cast suspicion upon a woman. Frida's eyes widened. Then who? Someone who believed jealousy between women would distract us. Poirot's gaze moved to Dr. Björnsson. "You loved Mademoiselle Ingrid, Docteur. You believed Haraldsson stood between you, not only as guardian of the fortune, but as destroyer of your scientific reputation." Björnsson shook his head violently. "I admired her, yes, but murder? Never. Yet you borrowed Haraldsson's Arctic fox coat on the night of the crime, claiming chill during your photography. Traces of that rare fur were upon the cyanide vial. You prepared the coffee in the kitchen while others dressed for outdoors. A simple matter to add the crystals, knowing only Haraldsson would drink from his personal thermos." "Lies!" Björnsson cried, rising. "Anyone could have—" "No." Poirot's voice cut like a whip. The poison acted swiftly, yet not instantly. Haraldsson drank indoors before stepping out. The collapse was delayed until he reached the terrace, providing mutual alibis for all. Brilliant but flawed. He produced a small glass tube containing dark residue. "Scrapings from your pipe, Docteur. Cyanide crystals lodge in the stem when handled without care. And this," he laid a folded note beside it, "found hidden in Haraldsson's safe. In his handwriting, 'Beware E.B. Obsession with I.L. dangerous.' He feared you would harm her if he refused consent." Ingrid gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Björnsson slumped back into his chair, face ashen. "But the attempts on Monsieur Poirot," Hagen interjected. "The sedative, the shot—" "Desperate improvisations," Poirot replied. "When the doctor realized I suspected the timing discrepancy, he acted to delay or silence me. The generator sabotage provided darkness for the shot." Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire. At length Björnsson spoke, voice hollow. "He laughed at me, said I was a dreamer, unfit for his niece's hand or his fortune. I saw the cyanide in the study, meant for specimens. It seemed fate." He buried his face in his hands. Hagen stepped forward with cuffs. "Erik Björnsson, I arrest you for the murder of Magnus Haraldsson." As the doctor was led away, Poirot turned to the others. Ingrid wept quietly. Frida stared into the flames. Olsen poured himself a stiff aquavit. Outside, the aurora began to build once more. Great curtains of green and violet sweeping across the stars, magnificent and indifferent. Poirot watched it for a long moment. "The lights dance on," he said softly to Inspector Hagen. "They have seen many tragedies in their long history. One more changes nothing." Yet even as the sky blazed in triumph, shadows lengthened across the snow, and the lodge seemed to breathe a sigh, half relief, half sorrow, as the truth at last stepped into the light. Chapter 7. The False Aurora. The arrest of Dr. Erik Björnsson should have brought calm to the lodge, yet the air remained heavy with unease. Outside, the northern lights had faded to a mere shimmer on the horizon, as though even the sky grew weary of the drama it had illuminated. Inside, the fire burned low, and the constables stood watch at doors and windows, while Inspector Hagen completed his paperwork by lamplight. Hercule Poirot, however, was not satisfied. He sat apart in a high-backed chair, hands folded over the head of his cane, eyes half-closed in profound concentration. Some small discord, troubled the symmetry of the solution. The little grey cells protested. All the evidence pointed to Björnsson, the cyanide residue in his pipe, the note of warning in Haraldson's hand, the motive of thwarted love and threatened exposure, the borrowed fur coat. And yet, Poirot rose abruptly and sought out Inspector Hagen in the study. "Mon cher Inspector," he said quietly, "a word, if you please. I must ask you to delay the doctor's removal to Tromsø until morning." Hagen looked up in surprise. "But the case is closed, monsieur. The man has all but confessed." "Has he?" Poirot's moustaches twitched. "He admitted opportunity and anger, yes. But the precise words, 'it seemed fate,' those are not a full confession. And certain details, they do not fit with perfection." He laid out his doubts with meticulous care. First, the lipstick upon the thermos rim. Frida's shade, stolen and applied deliberately to mislead. But why would Björnsson, a scientist accustomed to precision, resort to so crude a feminine ruse? It felt theatrical, almost spiteful, more the act of a woman than a man. Second, the attempts upon Poirot himself. The sedative in the tisane had been a heavy dose of veronal, taken from the medicine cabinet, yes, but also from Ingrid Larsson's personal travelling case. She suffered migraines and kept the drug for relief. The gunshot in the darkness had come from a small lady's pistol registered to her late mother, kept in her jewellery box. Third, the codicil to the will. The handwriting was Haraldson's, but the phrasing curiously formal, almost legalistic. Björnsson, desperate and impulsive, would not have paused to forge documents. He would have acted swiftly. Hagen listened gravely. "You suspect Mademoiselle Larsson?" "I suspect," Poirot corrected, "that we have been dazzled by a false aurora, a brilliant display meant to draw the eye away from the true source of light." He proposed a final reconstruction. At midnight, when the house slept, Poirot and Hagen quietly woke the others and requested their presence on the terrace once more. The constables stood discreetly inside the doors. The night was bitterly cold and clear. Stars glittered like ice crystals, but no aurora graced the sky. "Stand as you did on the fatal night," Poirot instructed. They obeyed with varying degrees of reluctance. Björnsson, wrists lightly bound, was placed where he had stood photographing. Poirot took Haraldson's position by the tripod. "Now," he said softly, "we shall see what really occurred." He turned to Ingrid. "Mademoiselle, you stated you were assisting Frida with her scarf. Yet Frida's scarf was fastened securely, by herself, indoors. You were, in fact, the one who suggested bringing Haraldson's thermos outdoors. 'Uncle will need his coffee against the cold,' you said. And it was you who carried it from the kitchen." Ingrid's face remained composed, but her gloved hands tightened upon the railing. "You prepared the coffee yourself," Poirot continued, "not Frida. She poured the general pot, yes, but you filled your uncle's personal thermos separately, adding the cyanide while alone in the pantry. A simple matter. The crystals dissolve instantly, leaving no trace but the faint almond odour, masked by brandy." "Lies," Ingrid whispered, but her voice trembled. "No. The lipstick was your own brilliant touch, applied after the poison, then wiped almost clean, leaving just enough to implicate Frida and sow discord. You knew of her lost tube and used it to reinforce the misdirection." Björnsson stared at her in horror. "Ingrid? No." She ignored him. "And my motive, monsieur? Greed? Everyone knows the will favoured charity." "Ah, but the codicil, the one you forged so carefully in Haraldsson's hand. You showed it to him weeks ago, claiming he had drafted it. He believed you, trusted you utterly. But it was never signed by witnesses. Upon his death you intended to produce it, secure in the knowledge that no one would challenge a grieving niece." Poirot's voice softened. "But there was more, was there not? Your uncle had discovered your secret debts, gambling in Paris, money borrowed against future inheritance. He threatened to cut you off entirely unless you reformed. And the intended remarriage was no fiction on his part. He had truly met a woman in Bergen, one who loved him for himself, not his fortune. You could not bear to lose everything." Ingrid's composure cracked. Tears glittered in her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. "You interfered," she said bitterly to Poirot. "If you had not come, Eric would have taken the blame. He was desperate enough, obsessed enough. I encouraged his attentions, let him believe I returned them. The note, in the safe, I planted it myself." Björnsson recoiled as though struck. "And the attempts upon me?" Poirot asked. "Necessary," she said coldly. "You saw too much. The veronal was meant to make you sleep through the night. The pistol, a warning if you persisted." Hagen stepped forward. "Ingrid Larsson, I arrest you for the murder of Magnus Haraldsson." She did not resist as the cuffs were fastened. Only once, as she was led past Björnsson, did she pause. "I am sorry, Eric," she said, almost gently. "You were useful." The doctor turned away, face buried in his hands. Poirot watched her go, then turned to the dark sky. For a moment, the faintest ripple of green light appeared on the horizon, a ghost of the great display that had witnessed the crime. "The Aurora returns," he murmured to Hagen, briefly, shyly, like truth itself, elusive, but never truly absent. The terrace emptied. Inside, the lodge seemed to settle, the weight of deception finally lifted. But Hercule Poirot knew that one more revelation awaited the morning light. Chapter 8. Confrontation Beneath the Veil. The lodge lay hushed under a thin veil of cloud, the stars hidden as though reluctant to witness what must follow. It was well past midnight, yet no one slept. The constables stood at their posts, rifles slung, breath pluming white in the frigid air. Inside, lamps burned low, casting long corridors of shadow. Hercule Poirot had requested one final gathering, not in the great room, but on the terrace where Magnus Haraldsson had breathed his last. The cold was ferocious, a blade against the skin, but Poirot insisted. Truth, he said, must be spoken beneath the same indifferent sky that had watched the crime. They came reluctantly, Ingrid Larsson, pale and defiant between two constables. Dr. Björnsson, wrists freed now, his face a mask of bewildered anguish. Captain Olsen, surly and red-eyed from Aquavit. Frida Haraldsson, wrapped in a dark cloak, eyes wide with the shock of revelations. Inspector Hagen stood at Poirot's side, notebook closed. He would need no notes for what was to come. Poirot waited until all were assembled, then spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the frozen silence. Mesdames et messieurs, we have pursued many false trails in this affair. The Aurora has dazzled us, as it was meant to do. But now the veil lifts, the true murderer stands among us, and the little grey cells have seen through the deception. He turned first to Björnsson. Docteur, you believed yourself guilty in your heart, obsessed with Mademoiselle Ingrid, fearful of exposure. You allowed suspicion to settle upon you like snow, but you did not poison the coffee. You are innocent of murder. Björnsson's head jerked up, hope and confusion warring in his eyes. Poirot's gaze moved to Ingrid. "Mademoiselle, you played your part brilliantly. The forged codicil, the planted note, the encouragement of Björnson's devotion, all to create a perfect scapegoat. The lipstick misdirection, the attempts upon my life with your own pistol and medication, these were bold, but they betrayed you. A woman's touches, precise and personal." Ingrid lifted her chin. "You have no proof beyond supposition." "Au contraire," Poirot replied softly. "The cyanide residue was not in Björnson's pipe alone. A second trace, fainter but unmistakable, was found upon the silver cigarette case you carry, mademoiselle. You handled the crystals when transferring them from the medical vial to a small paper twist, easier to pour into the thermos unseen. The case was in your pocket, a few grains lodged in the engraving." Hagen nodded confirmation. The laboratory in Tromsø had wirelessed the results only hours earlier. Ingrid's composure wavered. Even if I handled it, that proves nothing." "It proves carelessness," Poirot said. "And there is more. The thermos itself. Haraldsson's fingerprints were upon the cup. Yes, but yours overlay them, mademoiselle, on the lid. You closed it, after adding the poison, in the pantry, while the others were upstairs dressing. A thumbprint perfectly preserved in the condensation." Her breath came sharp and quick now, visible in the cold air. "But the deepest proof," Poirot continued, "is in the human heart. Your uncle trusted you utterly. His beloved niece, the daughter he never had. He confided his fears, his plans. You knew of the Bergen woman, knew your debts were discovered. You forged the codicil not for immediate gain, but as insurance should suspicion fall elsewhere. When I arrived, summoned by Haraldsson himself, you realized the danger. Björnson's hopeless passion made him the ideal shadow to cast over the crime." Ingrid's eyes darted toward the dark trees beyond the terrace, but the constable stood firm. Captain Olsen broke the silence with a rough laugh. "So the Ice Maiden melts at last. I suspected her all along. Too calm, too perfect." Frida stared at Ingrid as though seeing her for the first time. "You killed him. For money. For survival," Ingrid whispered. Her voice broke. "He was going to disinherit me entirely. Everything I had was his gift, and he was taking it away. The gambling, it started small in Paris. Then the debts grew. He found the letters from the creditors. He said I had shamed the family name. The woman in Bergen, she was real. He planned to marry in spring, start anew. I would have been left with nothing." Tears froze upon her cheeks. Björnsson took a step toward her. "Ingrid, I loved you. I would have helped you." She looked at him with sudden scalding pity. "You were a boy with dreams, Eric. I needed certainty." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, the cold to bite deeper. At last Ingrid spoke again, voice steady now. It was quick. He felt little pain. The aurora was so beautiful that night. He died watching the lights he loved. She turned to Hagen. "I will make a full statement." The inspector signalled, and the constables moved forward. Ingrid offered her wrists without resistance. As she passed Poirot, she paused. "You are everything he said you were, Monsieur Poirot. He admired you greatly. I almost wish he had never sent for you." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Truth is a stern mistress, mademoiselle. She waits for no one." Ingrid was led away. The terrace emptied until only Poirot and Hagen remained. The clouds parted briefly. A final shimmer of green light rippled across the sky, faint, ethereal, the last whisper of the Aurora Borealis. Poirot watched it fade. "A fitting curtain," he murmured. "Magnificent, deceptive, and in the end, revealing." Hogan shivered. "A cold business, monsieur." "Indeed," Poirot agreed, turning toward the warmth of the lodge. But justice, like the Arctic winter, is implacable, and the little grey cells, they burn brighter than any northern lights. Chapter 9. The Little Grey Cells. Illuminate the following morning broke crisp and clear, the Arctic sun a pale disk skimming the horizon, gilding the snow with rose and gold. The police snowcat stood ready to depart, engine idling like a patient beast. Ingrid Larsson, wrapped in a borrowed coat, was escorted to the vehicle without protest, her face composed now, as though a mask had settled permanently upon her features. Before the party dispersed, Hercule Poirot requested one final assembly in the great room. The fire had been rebuilt high. The trophies on the walls seemed to watch with glassy indifference as the survivors gathered. Dr. Björnsson, hollow-eyed and silent. Captain Olsen, nursing a mug of black coffee. Frida Haraldsson clutching the locket that held her true father's image. Inspector Hagen, notebook at the ready. Poirot stood before the hearth, small and impeccable, his green eyes bright with the satisfaction of order restored. Mes amis, he began, his voice precise and musical. It is customary, n'est-ce pas, for the detective to explain the workings of the puzzle once solved. You have been patient, more than patient, amid suspicion and danger. You deserve the full light of truth. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. The crime was simple in execution, complex in misdirection. Magnus Haraldsson was poisoned by cyanide introduced into his personal thermos of coffee. The collapse was timed to occur outdoors, beneath the Aurora, so that all might serve as alibis for one another, brilliant, but dependent upon exact timing. He paused, letting the words settle. The murderer relied upon three great deceptions. First, the spectacular beauty of the northern lights themselves, to draw every eye upward, away from earthly malice. Second, the creation of multiple motives scattered like seed upon snow, so that suspicion fell equally upon all. Third, the careful construction of a scapegoat. Poor Dr. Björnsson, whose hopeless passion and scientific disagreements made him ideal. Björnsson stirred, but said nothing. Mademoiselle Ingrid, Poirot continued, you alone had the intimacy and trust to execute the plan. You prepared the thermos in the pantry while others were upstairs. You added the cyanide, taken from the medical stores and carried in a twist of paper. A few crystals only, they dissolve instantly. You closed the lid, leaving your thumbprint over your uncle's. Then you suggested bringing it outdoors. Uncle will need his coffee against the cold. He held up the thermos, now wrapped in evidence cloth. The lipstick trace, your masterstroke of misdirection. You applied a touch of Frida's stolen lipstick to the rim after poisoning, then wiped most away, leaving just enough to implicate a woman and set niece against adopted daughter. The planted note in the safe, the forged codicil, all prepared in advance to bolster the illusion of broader conspiracy. Captain Olsen grunted. And the attacks on you, monsieur? Desperation, Capitaine. When I began to question the timing, the delayed action of the poison, the stopped watch that lied, Ingrid realized the net tightened. The veronal in my tisane came from her own supply, the pistol shot in the darkness from her mother's small weapon. She hoped to delay or frighten me until the storm passed, and confusion might allow escape. Frida spoke for the first time, voice low. She smiled at me that night, offered to adjust my scarf. All the while, precisely, Poirot said gently. The coldest heart often wears the warmest smile. He turned to Björnsson. Docteur, you suffered most. You believed yourself capable of the crime in your despair. But you are innocent, though perhaps guilty of loving unwisely. Björnsson managed a shaky nod. Poirot addressed them all. The anonymous letters, The planted Sami knife, the sabotage generator, all were Ingrid's work, designed to suggest outside enemies or general chaos. But the little grey cells demand order. Once the false aurora of misdirection was penetrated, the truth shone clear. He placed the pocket watch upon the mantel. This, perhaps, was Haraldsson's own silent testimony. The hands stopped at 11:47, the moment he drank indoors, realizing too late the bitterness beneath the brandy. He pulled the crown in his final moments, a desperate signal that the timing was wrong. He carried it outside and collapsed as planned, by the murderer, but the watch remained his accusation. A long silence followed, broken only by the crackle of logs. Inspector Hagen closed his notebook. "A tragic affair, monsieur. Greed dressed as family loyalty." "Indeed," Poirot replied, "but also fear. Fear of losing the only security she had known. Human motives are seldom pure." He looked toward the window, where the fjord glittered beneath the low sun. "The aurora will return tonight, magnificent as ever. Nature is indifferent to our little dramas. Yet justice, like the Arctic light, persists, elusive at times, but eternal." The group dispersed quietly. Björnson would return to his research, chastened. Olsen to his ships, debts settled by Haraldsson's true will. Frida to Oslo, to seek her own path with the modest legacy her adopted father had quietly secured for her. Ingrid Larsson was taken down the track in the Snowcat, bound for trial in Tromsø. Poirot lingered a moment longer before the fire, warming his hands. "Ah, mon ami," he said to the absent Hastings in his mind, "what a case! The cold is abominable, but the triumph of order se réchauffe le cœur." Outside, the northern sky waited, patient and vast, for night and the return of its dancing lights. Chapter 10. Resolution under the northern sky. The coastal steamer that would carry Hercule Poirot south departed Tromsø at dawn 2 days later. The harbour lay still under a dusting of fresh snow, the water black and glassy between the hulls of fishing boats. Poirot stood at the rail as the lines were cast off, his breath clouding in the sharp air, his moustaches impeccably waxed despite the rigours of the Arctic. Behind him, the town receded, wooden houses painted red and ochre, the stark triangle of the Arctic cathedral, the mountains rising like white sentinels into a sky already touched with the promise of returning light. The polar night was ending. Each day now brought a few more minutes of sun, and with it the slow awakening of the north. Inspector Hogan had accompanied him to the quay, along with Frida Haraldsson, who had insisted upon bidding him farewell. "You gave us truth, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, her dark eyes steady for the first time since her arrival. "It was not the truth I came seeking, but perhaps it is the one I needed." Poirot inclined his head. "Truth is often unwelcome, mademoiselle. Yet it is the only foundation upon which one may build anew. Your father, adopted though he was, left you a modest legacy, and more importantly, the freedom to discover who you truly are." She managed a small smile. "I shall return to Oslo, study art as I always wished. The locket with my real father's picture, I will keep it, but no longer as a wound, as a beginning." Hagen shook Poirot's hand firmly. "Norway owes you a debt, monsieur. A quiet case, perhaps, by your standards, but one that might have ended in greater tragedy had you not unravelled it so completely." "Quiet?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Mon cher inspecteur, there were attempts upon my life, a forged will, a scapegoat cruelly manipulated. No, it was not quiet, but order has been restored, and that is all that matters." The steamer's whistle sounded, deep and mournful. Poirot turned for a final glance northward. Far beyond the town, above the distant peaks, the sky kindled with the faintest shimmer of green, the Aurora Borealis returning for one last display, as if in farewell. He watched it for a long moment, the ethereal curtains rippling in silence. "Magnificent," he murmured. Indifferent to human passion, yet somehow complicit in revealing it, the perfect witness, beautiful, impartial, and eternal. Hagen followed his gaze. The Sami say the lights are the spirits of the dead dancing? Perhaps, Poirot replied softly. Or perhaps they are simply the earth's breath, made visible, reminding us how small our dramas are beneath such vastness. The ship cleared the harbour and steamed south, the fjords unfolding in sombre beauty on either side. Poirot retreated to the warmth of the saloon, where a steward brought him a cup of excellent chocolate. He settled into a corner, opening a small leather-bound notebook to record his final observations. Ingrid Larsen would stand trial in spring. The evidence was irrefutable, her confession complete. She had shown neither remorse nor plea for mercy, only a cold acceptance that her carefully constructed world had crumbled. Dr. Björnson had departed for the mainland the previous day, his scientific career damaged but not destroyed. Haraldsson's genuine notes on the magnetic minerals would be published under joint credit, a posthumous act of fairness the explorer had intended before his death. Captain Olsen, grumbling but relieved, had received his back wages from the estate, and a bonus for his silence regarding old smuggling sins. He would captain one of the new tourist vessels after all, on honest terms this time. And the lodge itself, Haraldsson's dragon-styled retreat, would be sold, the proceeds funding genuine Arctic research, as his true will directed. Poirot closed the notebook with a snap. "Ah, Hastings," he said to the absent friend in his imagination. "You would have adored the Northern Lights. Such drama, such colour. But the true illumination, mon ami, came not from the sky, but from the little grey cells." Weeks later, back in his London flat with its central heating and orderly comforts, Poirot sat by the fire one evening, a tisane balanced upon his knee. Outside, rain pattered against the windows, soft English rain, so different from the savage Arctic snows. He lifted his cup in a small, private toast. "To Magnus Haraldsson," he said aloud, "who sought the lights and found death beneath them. And to the Aurora Borealis, silent witness, eternal dancer." Somewhere far north, the lights continued their ancient performance, veils of green and violet sweeping across the stars, indifferent to the fleeting lives below. But order had prevailed, justice had been served, and Hercule Poirot permitted himself the faintest smile of satisfaction.